The very first thing I saw that morning was a backhoe, not out on some distant job, but crawling right along the edge of my shoreline, its metal teeth glittering in the cold like a bad idea with a purpose, and for a second I thought I was still half asleep. Then the coffee went cold in my hand because those men were on my land. My name is Vince, and the strip of shoreline I'm talking about has been in my family for 3 generations, Lake Evergreen, northern Michigan. And that morning, watching heavy equipment roll across what my grandfather once mended his nets over, I realized this wasn't going to be a squabble over a fence. This was going to be a war. I inherited the place 5 years ago after both my parents passed within months of each other. I was living in Chicago, neck deep in a corporate grind I didn't like when the deed landed in my lap. It felt like fate handing me an exit sign, so I quit. I packed and I moved back to the cabin where summers had been stitched into every floorboard. This was supposed to be peace. Turns out peace has neighbors, and sometimes neighbors have plans. Trouble started when the Maple Ridge subdivision went up on the east side of the lake. Glossy houses, big budgets, people who wanted rustic lake living with central air. From the start, the HOA, led by a woman named Rita, kept looking at my shoreline like it was an extra amenity they forgot to put on their brochure. They started with requests, community aesthetics, shared access, that sort of thing. And when I politely said no, they escalated. Complaints showed up in the county files, strangers left notes on my mailbox. Someone spray-painted a word on my property that felt more like a threat than a critique. So when a crew showed up that spring and told me they had permits to build 12 cabins on my shoreline, cabins Maple Ridge residents could reserve for guests, I didn't laugh. I pulled on boots over pajama pants and went down to the water. They handed me printed plans with county stamps and told me to take it up with the HOA. I told them this was private property. They told me there'd been a survey that put part of the shoreline in a county easement from the 70s. I told them my deed said otherwise. That was the first meeting. That was also the start of the 3-year headache that followed. I did what most people do when their land is threatened. I pulled out every document I owned, called Thomas, the local attorney who had helped my family before, and tried to keep the conversation civil. Rita came by later with the HOA attorney and a county rep in tow, smiles, handshakes, that slow, polite kind of pressure. They spoke about community benefits, property values, and how generous they were being. They also mentioned a survey done 3 months earlier. When Thomas asked who had requested it, Rita said, "Our community wanted clearer boundaries." Thing was, I had received no notice of any survey. Not a letter, not a knock, nothing. I won't pretend the next part wasn't exhausting. There were late nights with paperwork spread across my kitchen table, phone calls with the county, and the creeping suspicion that someone had quietly moved pieces on the board. Despite an emergency injunction Thomas filed to stop any construction, Maple Ridge kept pushing. They organized a picnic on my shore stakes placed where the cabins would go, and their people began removing my no trespassing signs at night. I installed cameras. The footage showed neighbors in matching t-shirts sneaking around like a commune gone rogue. One morning a bulldozer started chewing at the trees. I stood in front of it and called the sheriff. The operator had paperwork he swore was legit. The situation should have been cut and dry. My injunction was on file, but the bulldozer driver insisted the HOA had finalized permits. That's when things began to feel less like local posturing and more like someone had greased the wheels. Thomas dug. He asked questions and filed a Freedom of Information request for communications between the county and Maple Ridge. What we found made me sick: an email trail showing a county official, the same county rep who'd stood there smiling, telling the HOA leader they'd found a workaround to update the survey records directly. There was also mention of a sizable donation to the Parks Fund from Maple Ridge. "That sounds like a bribe," Thomas said quietly over the phone, and I felt my stomach drop. I started to understand the scale of what I was up against. This wasn't just an HOA pushing its weight, this was entitlement, rubbing shoulders with influence. The paper trail went to the district attorney. It didn't stop there. While investigations began, Rita doubled down publicly, leading protests on my shoreline and painting me as the selfish obstacle to community access. Local news trucks showed up. People who'd believed her story held signs and shouted. It felt surreal standing on my own porch while a crowd yelled about communal rights over my private land. But the world has a funny way of bringing its own light to dark corners. I had been proactive. I'd invited Dr. Alina Vargas, a local environmental scientist, to inspect the proposed sites. She documented endangered plants and nesting areas for loons' real state-protected habitats. Her report went to the environmental office. That combined with the FOIA emails, Thomas turned over to the DA, started to peel the mask off what was happening. Then came the twist I hadn't expected, one of Rita's own board members. Patricia had grown uncomfortable with the lies and threats. She secretly recorded a meeting, a recording where Rita bragged about handling the survey with a donation in the right hands and relying on friends in county offices to make this work. Patricia handed the recording to Sheriff Diaz, a woman who had been quietly building a solid case behind the scenes. The next day, Rita was arrested, cuffed in a designer dress, her mugshot splashed across the local stations. The county rep was put on leave and later arrested. The $75,000 donation turned out to be funneled into accounts it shouldn't have touched. The FBI took an interest. Suddenly, what had been a small-town land fight was a criminal investigation. Justice moved in fits and starts. Rita's trial unfolded like something out of a show. Text messages, testimonies, the sticky evidence of greed. The jury didn't take long. Guilty. Rita got time in prison and restitution to pay. The county official received a ban from public office. The HOA was forced to restructure, and the board that replaced Rita's cronies included people who actually respected property lines and the environment. It didn't end in a courtroom, though. The most satisfying part came afterward in a way that felt quieter but bigger. After the dust settled, the new HOA reached out with a real olive branch and offered to partner on conservation rather than fight over property lines. Patricia led the effort. They proposed a nature preserve for Lake Evergreen rather than the 12 cabins Rita had dreamed of. It was a proposal I met with skepticism. I'd been burned. But Dr. Vargas and I helped design a restoration plan. Maple Ridge chipped in to fund tree replanting and a small nature center on their side of the lake. Volunteers, some of them people who'd once been at my property line with signs, came to my shoreline and planted saplings where the bulldozers had stolen trees. I won't pretend the healing was instant. There were awkward moments, apologies that felt rehearsed, and the lingering memory of how close the place had come to being lost. But seeing children learn to spot loons again, watching native plants nurse back to life, that felt like a victory that no court order could fully describe. Rita served part of her sentence, then moved away. She later sent a short letter apologizing. I kept it in a drawer as a reminder that people can confess their wrongs and also that power can corrupt in ways that feel both petty and monstrous. What I learned, the thing that reached me slowly between paperwork and court dates, was this. Sometimes protection requires standing up, not because you want to be a hero, but because something irreplaceable is at stake. The shoreline wasn't just my property. It was a habitat, a memory, a piece of the world my grandfather chose. Standing my ground was about setting a line that said, we don't trade the wild for convenience. And here's the little twist of grace: turning that fight into a new purpose gave me back something unexpected. The preserve grew into the life's work I didn't know I wanted. I started running educational walks from a small visitor center I built near the cabin. Local schools began bringing kids to learn about nesting loons and native plants. The community that once marched on my shore now helped protect it. The cabins never happened. The bulldozers never finished their work. The fraudulent easement was corrected, and the property documents now sit with a permanence I can trust. So what's the moral? Maybe it's obvious: money and influence can move fast, but paper trails and people who refuse to look away can move faster. Maybe it's a softer lesson that sometimes the right fight is the one that ends up making more people better stewards of what they share instead of claiming what they don't own. For me, the real victory wasn't the arrest or the settlement. It was watching the community choose preservation over exploitation and then choosing to do the hard work of fixing the damage they'd helped cause. Now, as I sit on the dock at sunset, the water shimmering, the same way it did when my grandfather taught me to skip stones, I can see the new saplings, hear the loons, and know the place feels whole again. It wasn't easy getting here. It took lawyers, cameras, a brave whistleblower, and a small army of volunteers with muddy hands. But it was worth it. So I want to ask you, if you were in my shoes, would you have fought as hard? Or would you have taken the peace of walking away and let somebody else make the tough choices? Tell me the worst thing you've seen someone do in the name of community, or share a time you stepped up to protect something that mattered. I'd love to hear your story. And yeah, if you've got a similar fight, tell it below.